4. Germanism abroad. 1. The United States. The task of spreading the heathenish cult of Germanism in foreign lands was declared to the General School Association, an organization maintained by the Pan-German League. Beginning its operations in 1881, that association, existing today as the notorious German Ausland Organisation, AO, was the first to prepare the ground and develop and test the tactics which are being used today by all German fifth columnists. Of all the countries in which he spread his evil doctrines, it was only in the United States that the German had any doubts about the successful retention and development of Germanism. So much so, in fact, that Professor Hasse, in one of his speeches before the German Reichstag, declared that the, quote, grave of Germanism lies in America, end quote, and the spade which will dig that grave is the Monroe Doctrine. But not all exponents of Germanism, however, felt so forlornly about their chances of successfully propagating Germanism in this country, and they made many early attempts to reorganize and strengthen their movements here. In effect, the Germans did not achieve any notable success in their work. The Americans of German origin or descent either had no interest in preserving his German identity in contradistinction to his pride in being labeled an American, or else because he had fled his native land precisely on account of such malignant beliefs and persecutions. He retained no desire or inclination to see those evils flourish in a land of freedom which he had come to adopt as his own. German fury, stirred to fever-pitch heights by the apoplectic rantings of German leaders, expressed itself against the United States many times. The first of these crises occurred in the time of the Spanish-American War, when Germany tried to raise a coalition of nations to oppose our stand. Next, it was Germany's plan to effect a European customs union against the United States, a step which was immediately followed by attempts first to annex Samoa and then to break the force of the Monroe Doctrine by testing it in Venezuela. All of these attempts failed, principally because of England's refusal to act in collusion with Germany against an independent United States, as well as England's firm acceptance and advocacy of the Monroe Doctrine as a major and permanent policy of our country. Chagrined at her failures to impress her will upon the United States, Germany decided to try new tactics. She adopted a policy of take it easy, a policy which she hated because it was one antagonistic to her natural ideals of arrogance, brute force, and aggression, and contrary to the spirit of her war soul. Such inherent hatred of Germany to adhere to a sane course of international procedure, which takes into account human rights and decencies, as well summarized by one of her most able and popular political writers, Dr. Paul Rohrbach, who exclaimed, does anyone think that Germany likes saying nice things to the United States, or that they are the outpourings of a loving heart? She only says them because Germany must eradicate the suspicions with which Americans regard her policy. Because of their common language and their humanistic philosophies, the Germans regarded both England and the United States as dire enemies of his superstate, and therefore his main function as a troublemaker in the latter country expressed itself in attempting to drive a wedge between it and England. Part of his hatred for England was directed towards it for its, quote, not feeling ashamed, end quote, to openly recognize the Monroe Doctrine. Again and again, reference to the doctrine creeps up in connection with the origin and development of Germanism in the United States. In 1903, Johannes Vollet declared that, quote, the Monroe Doctrine is indefensible. It is direct impertinence, and all the more so as America is lacking the means to enforce its application, end quote. The perpetual opposition of Germany to the Monroe Doctrine, as well as its continued defiance of it, was best delineated in an article printed at the beginning of the century by the Journal of Commerce, in answer to the German claim that the Monroe Doctrine was, quote unquote, an empty pretension. The purpose of that message is so fraught with vigor and truth, its every word so fresh and alive and currently apropos, that it deserves quotation here in full. The last German professor, Mommsen, to fall foul of the Monroe Doctrine, seems to show the usual Teutonic incapacity to understand what it means. He assumes that this quote-unquote empty pretension on the part of the United States is to control the destiny of the South American nations and to keep Europeans out of them. He cannot see that the United States seeks no predominance, but only objects to European predominance. The German mind fails to see that our policy is to leave South American countries independent to develop on their own lines. And all we ask of Europe is that it shall leave them independent and not undertake to appropriate their territory or suppress their sovereignty. The United States wishes South America to do its own controlling. Failing constantly in their attempts to drive a wedge between the two English speaking countries, Germans were instructed by their headquarters to try to create a force of their own with which to combat Americans. In reviewing this angle of attack, Professor Hasse stated that the only way in which he could envision a future for Germanism in the United States was for the Germans to, quote, so organize and educate the German element in that country that political power will finally fall into its lap, end quote. And in order to do so, the professor advises that, quote, Germans must abandon all attempts to take sides on democratic and republican matters and form themselves into a national political party, end quote. Another professor, Münsterberg, agreed with Hasse by adding that the Germans should build a state within a state in the United States. Still another German writer added that the best way for the Germans to form a political party of their own was to infect the American, especially those of Irish extraction, with the German virus of Anglophobia. The recommendation was also made that the Germans appoint a confidential agent in Washington who might keep in touch with the American government and influence it. All these wild notions of Germanism produced a great deal of agitation in this country, but the German was not able to maintain that any real progress had been made by his movement in the United States. It is only since the rise of present Germany and its quote unquote exported agitators, as well as hired spies and bribed sycophants, that the nightmare of Germanism has been forced through coercion and terror down the throats of a slight handful of Americans of German descent. 2. South America. German designs in South America, particularly towards Brazil, as well as the underhanded methods they employed in trying to further their interests there, have never been kept entirely secret. Long before the advent of the present German government, Germans have always covetously regarded South America as a land which someday would belong to them. That to pursue such a course might bring them face to face with the power of the United States was an eventuality they foresaw and for which they prepared. They felt no uncertainty as long as their ultimate success against the United States. In scores of books, prominent German authors have time and again made the forecast that the United States would, through fear, yield to the Germans without striking a blow, or else would capitulate in a short war. In any event, the Germans were instructed to be prepared for that day, for that day must come for the German. Such warnings, persistently expressed by German writers, teachers, and statesmen, were fully clarified in the statement of Professor Schultz-Gavernitz to the effect that the more Germany is condemned in an attitude of passive resistance towards the United States, the more emphatically must she defend her interest in Central and South America. For this purpose, we need a fleet capable not only of coping with the miserable forces of the South American states, but powerful enough to cause Americans to think twice before making any attempt to apply the Monroe Doctrine in South America. German colonists to South America were encouraged to preserve their nationality, their language, their German ways of life, and their interest in the quote unquote mother country. Thus, there came to exist, especially in Brazil, states within states. The methods the Germans used in Brazil were those applied in strict accordance with the principles expounded by Dr. Kopf in his brochure on the quote unquote German schools. In that work is found the cautious advice that, quote, Germans in South Brazil had better become Brazilian citizens, as that is the quickest and surest way to obtain political power, end quote. Dr. Kopf also forewarns his countrymen that the danger of Germanism in South America comes from North America, and it is not only a question of commercial interest. Is Germany to stand idly by if America sets about the task of Americanizing that continent? Germany cannot, she must proclaim, urbi et orbi, that she is determined to maintain her rights in South America, and Brazil holds out the most buoyant hope for the German and the spread of Germanism. Dr. Kopp's declarations were amplified by Professor Gustav Schmoller, who emphatically asserted that, quote, at all cost, a German country must grow up in the 20th century in Brazil, end quote. For in South America, Germans will found a new Germany, quote, which shall prove a blessing to the old country and stand as a model to the new world, end quote. Dr. Paul Rohrbach's expressions of German intentions in Brazil were even more arrogantly expressed. He stated that, although the United States may possibly prevent the acquirement of South American territory by Germany, it cannot prevent the creation of a state within a state, and that when the Germans have finally accomplished that deed, they would rule the roost in Brazil and rule over the inferior peoples of that country. But propaganda must be made in Germany to popularize the idea, and every good German must assist in the work because a promising future for Germany lies in her South American colonies. And to attain those ends, Germans must work quietly, jointly, and firmly underground. Professor Wolff, coinciding with that view, expressed his opinions that, quote, South America, for the German, is the land of the future, for that land holds greater promise for the Germans than Europe or Africa, end quote. Hence we find, hand in hand with her march towards world dominion, Germany has already deemed it her mission to establish, by force or by trickery, great South American colonies. As she does today, Germany has always laughed at any actual resistance from the United States, consistently declaring our country to be nothing more than, to use the words of a German, quote, a heterogeneous melange of crass, egotistic jingoist, having no pure racial blood to build upon, end quote, and therefore a land and a people to be easily vanquished at any time by the great German supermen. Germany tried often to suit her words with action. Prince Solms Brunfels made a real effort to found a German colony in Texas as an American outpost of Germanism, and, though he failed, the idea which prompted his actions always persisted in the German mind as a possibility fraught with great promise and eventual fulfillment. The Pan-German League heeded the advice of its leaders to labor in partial silence in South America, and so keep unusual secrecy about their work on that continent. Little by little, they sought to honeycomb those parts of South America which seemed favorable to Germanism by establishing branch leagues and to reticulate those regions with confidential agents who carried out their work disguised as travelers, teachers, or diplomatic agents. From time to time, they reported their progress to the Central Association in Germany. The startling disclosure was only recently made that the German consultants, too, had given their aid, serving as hypodermics through which the malignant bacilli of Germanism was being syringed into the bloodstream of the South American peoples. In his work on Chile, Dr. Unfold advises German settlers in South America, quote, to send their children to Germany to be educated in a fitting German spirit, end quote, and that then they should be sent back to promulgate and disseminate the animus of the German war soul. Quote, the time has assuredly come, he encouraged, when Germany, during the confusion caused by some international conflagration, will have the opportunity to acquire colonial territory in South America, end quote. Records and facts, whose truths are every minute being sustained by current events, make it obvious that German policies in South America, her aims and methods too, have all been, for a long time, clearly, persistently, and publicly pronounced by her leaders. To the German, his aims in South America are merely some additional must-have items on a long list of German-planned depredations against humanity and civilization. Here, quoted ad verbatim, are the words of one observer of the German ambitions in South America, who, writing his analysis almost 20 years ago, declared, whether Germany's aim in South America is obtained without friction is something which the future alone can decide. The future of South America must depend largely upon the Monroe Doctrine and the Navy which is behind it. There will come a time, not so remote in the future, when the economic penetration of Brazil and other South American states by the Germans may lead to political supremacy, which, if questioned, must be abandoned or contended for. Conceivably, the issue may be a fighting one. Though Germans rave against the Monroe Doctrine as an empty pretension, the doctrine nevertheless is destined to bar Germany's way. Already there are unmistakable signs that Americans have become cognizant of such German aims and ambitions in South America. On the creation of a great American fleet, as on the solidarity of England and the United States, the fate of South America depends. If America is to cry, "Hands off," they must have the power to support the words. 3. Europe. Austria. True Germanism, being as it is a purely primitive paganism with some modern refinements, finds that it can express itself best by committing truly barbaric and bestial acts of violence against innocent civilized peoples. Thus, if Germanism were ever to prevail upon this earth, we can be sure that every step would be taken, though few indeed are these steps which the Germans have not already taken, to reawaken every dormant animal instinct and vicious trait in man. Thus, it has been a chief aim of the German to eradicate each and every one of the three principal religions from the earth. However, the German was practical enough to realize that he could not successfully combat all these religions at one time with any hope of emerging supreme. But since their extinction was absolutely necessary to the propagation of the German dogma of hate and destruction, the Germans conceived their now infamous and oft-tried trick of pitting first the believers in one religion against those of another, until at a single coup they could deliver the final knockout blow against the single remaining adversary. It was in Austria that they first tested the efficiency of their scheme, a test which, at the time, actually constituted organizing high treason against that country. Germanism had its birth in Austria as an organized movement founded and headed by an Austrian statesman, von Schoenerer, in 1878. Its activity was rather limited in scope until 1898, when Schoenerer joined with Hasse. From that time on, the Pan-German League in Berlin became the head of the movement in Austria, and it proceeded at once to establish permanent bases of operation in that country. First, a plan of attack was decided upon. Hasse and Schoenerer agreed that if Germany was ever to rule over Austria, the latter country must first be forced to break with Rome, Roman Catholicism. In order to achieve this objective, the leaders decided upon a roundabout cause of action. They therefore first created an artificially simulated, pseudo-religious revivalist movement having anti-Semitism as its primary and immediate purpose. The German Hasse found some renegade, so-called Catholics, though such men were no more Catholic in spirit than those men of any religion who, hiding behind a pulpit of a church, railed against God and preached hatred and intolerance. Members of the leading Catholic party, who agreed to act as leaders of such a movement. It was not long thereafter that a frightful wave of anti-Semitic persecutions began to sweep over Austria, continuing unabated in intensity until Schoenerer and Hasse felt that a sufficiently high degree of agitation and terrorism had been reached. Thereupon, they turned their efforts against the Catholic party and in turn started a rabid anti-Catholic, free from Rome movement of their own. Schoenerer declaring that, quote, "the chains which tie us to a church hostile to Germanism must be broken," end quote. The quote-unquote "no popery" and anti-Catholic agitations was stimulated by Hasse and Schoenerer, though their introduction into Austria of numerous pseudo-evangelical freebooter German clergymen who were liberally paid with money and liquor to rail against the Catholics. Though the complete success of this plan was not achieved, it did have a salutary effect, that of establishing and providing the audacity and ruthless aggressiveness of the German. Czechoslovakia. Notwithstanding the fierce resistance which met them and their ideas in Bohemia, the Germans were able to organize various ancillary organizations of their league, as well as to maintain their own press in that country. They were further aided in their work by the importation of the German clergymen, agitators, and schoolmasters, all of whom played leading roles in the struggle to spread Germanism throughout that brave land of free thought. The vile work of the Germans was not easy. They were met with a bold and determined resistance. The Czechs fought the determined Germans with that fierce and patriotic intensity characteristic of their old hero, Hus, whose famous motto, "Nothing German," became their rallying call and slogan. In fact, so strong was the Czech resistance to Germanism that by 1900, leading Germans were ready to declare that the fate of their movement lay in Bohemia and depended on the outcome of their struggle in that country. Besides attempting to spread their doctrines, the Germans did everything possible to interfere with the establishment of the Czech language in Bohemia. It is to the redoubting credit of Czechoslovakia that even before it had become a nation, it had already fought alone against German dominion. Left to its own devices, it would have never have suffered surrender. Holland. A decade before the last World War, it was noted as a fact that the one state which Germany dreaded was Russia. The two states which she would like to see at odds with each other were Britain and the United States. And the one state she would really like to absorb was Holland, a free and democratic country which hated Germanism and all of its narrow spiritual and political principles. Nevertheless, the German pursued his work in that country with that fanatical stubbornness so embedded in his character. In 1898, a General Dutch League was formed in Holland primarily for the purpose of spreading the Dutch language in South Africa. Not meeting success, they appealed to the Pan-German League for aid and found themselves, shortly thereafter, to be entirely supported by that German organization. With their aptitude for protecting and adopting countries, the members of the League early regarded Holland as an essential and integral part of Germany and declared that it was not able to secure Holland by peaceful persuasions. They must do so by force. In 1901, a German writer stated that in case of a war, quote, Germany could not be expected to regard the Dutch ports as neutral and refrain from making use of them, end quote. Writing in the Deutsche Zeitschrift in 1901, Kurt von Strauss declared that, quote, it is impossible that outposts of Germanism like the Netherlands, Belgium, Switzerland, and Austria remain permanently outside the boundaries of Germany, end quote. At the same time, another German asserted that Germany would do well to secure possessions of the Dutch colonies as to acquire naval bases and additional overseas trade routes, while another suggested that the Dutch colonies were threatened by England, the United States, and Japan, and therefore must be protected by Germany. Though the League did manage to succeed in stirring up a great deal of mischief and agitation in Holland, Germanism was unable to achieve any marked success in that land so noted for its great intellectual freedom, a freedom which did not exist even among the highest class of Germans, who at the time were labeling the Dutch Low Germans. The Dutch wished to remain Dutch. They felt too strong and independent in their own freedom to need or desire the gangster-like protection of the brutish, uncivilized German. Belgium. Belgium has never been considered anything but a negligible factor in German plans for world domination. The German felt that because of its size, Belgium could easily, at any time, be forced to bow to the German will. However, they did not neglect Belgium entirely, and, as a matter of fact, he even adopted somewhat different tactics from those which he employed in other lands. Instead of trying his utmost to sponsor the use of the German language in Belgium, the German believed that his success in that country would depend upon his ability to popularize Flemish language in contradistinction to French. By thus creating a sense of Flemish nationalism in Belgium, the German hoped to prevent the spread of French influence and so drive a wedge between France and Belgium. However, the Germans were regarded with great suspicion by the Belgian populace and therefore was forced to carry on most of his work through underground channels. He failed to make much headway, but this failure did not dim his hopes of future realization. In fact, he was so certain that the seeds being planted would someday result in fruition that back in 1901 he had already, with habitual high and mighty German arrogance, renamed Belgium German Westmark. Denmark. As with Belgium, the German felt that his task in Denmark to be such an easy one that he did not even bother to use any finesse in his attempts to saturate the Danish people with his Germanism. And so, instead of trying to at least render the idea palatable to the Danes, he aimed at ramming it down their throats. Nothing came of such attempts. The Danes might be invaded by German arms. They would never fall victim to what the Germans call ideals, for the Danes are an independent, civilized people with no inclination to be dragged back 1,000 years to savage barbarism. Switzerland. The work of the German League in Switzerland was impeded by its own tactless and stupid blunders. The propagators of Germanism, past and present, have always failed in estimating the local or national patriotism of any peoples by completely undervaluing it. When therefore the German early and loudly proclaimed that Switzerland was merely an annex of Germany, that it had no culture and could maintain no freedom of its own, he was met with the most intense antagonism on the part of the majority of the Swiss. The Swiss have always burned with the desire to remain forever free, neutral, and independent, and everywhere the German was met with the firm declaration that we Swiss are no Germans. And what more vivid testimony to that fact can be offered than the moral to be gleaned from the story of William Tell, an admitted German classic written by a German author? Scandinavia. Of all countries in continental Europe, the German has always been the least liked in Norway and Sweden. And though from time to time pro German voices were raised, the German League enjoyed little success there. Instead of Germans, it was Norwegians and Swedes of a German character who paid allegiance to the German ideal, and in tracing the work of such traitors, it is not to be wondered at now that the Germans were able to find a Quisling in Norway. Professor Samasa, stating that the future struggle for existence would be between Germans on the one side and Britons and Americans on the other, remarked that, quote, Sweden will converge towards Germany the more Germany grows in power, and it is therefore a German interest to preserve the independence of Sweden. In such a way, this outland will eventually be absorbed by Germany. End quote.